Welcome, everybody. My name is Beth Fisher Yoshida, and I am the Program Director of the Master of Science in Negotiation and Conflict Resolution at Columbia University. And our program is a master's degree in, of course, negotiation and conflict resolution. And we host a series of webinars every month. We have many other activities, so if you're not familiar with the breadth and depth of things that we do, please feel free to visit our website. And today we are very fortunate to have Dr. Dianne Williams with us. Dianne has a very rich background. She does many different kinds of things. We're fortunate enough also that she will be teaching an elective course for us in restorative practices. And so in order not to shortchange Dianne and what she does, I feel inadequate in giving her a full introduction. So I'm going to turn it over to her, and Dianne will introduce herself and then speak and go through her slides. It probably will be about 30 minutes, at which time we will come back. I will come back on, and then Dianne and I will have a little bit of a discussion. And I encourage you to think about questions and comments you'd like to make, and to put it into the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. We have a Q&A box there. I will be checking the Q&A box, and Dianne will take questions at the end of her presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Dianne, and I look forward to listening to what you have to say.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Fisher Yoshida. Thank you to NECR for facilitating this webinar. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am Dianne Williams, and I consider myself to be a lifelong educator and peace builder. I'm a licensed trainer of trainers in restorative practices, an international mediator and consultant focusing on restorative practices and conflict and violence prevention. My most recent publication is entitled A Discursive Public Health Approach to Wrongdoing and the Wrongdoer, which I will be chatting a bit about today. And so I'll begin with a brief overview of restorative practices as I apply it, and follow with some discussion of my publication and intersperse it with some of my experiences over time. And then, as Dr. Fisher Yoshida said, we'll close with a Q&A session. So in some quarters, restorative practices and restorative justice are used interchangeably, but they're actually not. For me, restorative practices is a lifestyle. Your application of the practices in your everyday life, the manner in which you interact with your family, your community, your church, your co-workers. And restorative justice, for me, is the criminal justice system's response to wrongdoing. So from my perspective, restorative justice is subsumed under restorative practices. I have, however, seen it applied in the reverse. But regardless of the application, restorative practitioners acknowledge that the vast majority of wrongdoers can be rehabilitated, which necessarily means that a very small percentage must be relegated to the traditional criminal justice system. To be clear, restorative justice is not and was never meant to be an alternative to the existing criminal justice system. In fact, to be truly effective, restorative processes and principles must be embedded into and operate within the traditional criminal justice system. So let's talk a bit about the typologies specific to a restorative approach. The focus is undergirded by a very specific process. This process involves the victim, the wrongdoer. This is the offender restoratively referred to as the wrongdoer, the primary stakeholders, and their communities of care, both the victim's community of care and, surprisingly, the wrongdoer's community of care, with a goal of repairing the harm caused by the offense. And the main difference you'll see already is the fact that the wrongdoer's needs and attendant circumstances are taken into consideration. While there are many similarities, there are also some fundamental differences between restorative justice and mediation, and I just wanted to bring these to the fore up front. because some people also use those two interchangeably, and they are not. There are actually some fundamental differences. Both mediators and restorative practitioners are impartial, neutral, non-directive, and participants in both venues work to create their own outcomes. In restorative practices, unlike mediation, one person has caused harm to another. The wrongdoer must acknowledge and accept responsibility before the process can even be considered. And outcomes are managed beforehand in pre-conference interviews. So whereas in mediation, the outcomes are managed during the mediation, in restorative processes, the outcomes are actually managed before the parties get together in pre-conference interviews, which are a mandatory part of the restorative process. And perhaps more importantly, restorative practitioners are not in the business of negotiation. It's a very structured process that practitioners must follow. So there are three pillars of restorative principles: harms and needs, which ask the question, who was harmed? What was the harm caused? How can it be repaired? Obligations, which focus on who's responsible and accountable and how can she or he repair the harm? And engagement, which makes sure that victims, wrongdoers, and their communities of care all play an active role in the process. And again, I'll remind you, note that the offenders are restoratively referred to as wrongdoers, softening the harshness of the label and the feeling of exclusion. And that's really what the change in term is meant to do. So restorative justice is less about the conflict and more about the impact of the harm. It's less about punishing the wrongdoer for breaking the law and more about finding a way to heal the harm and to keep the wrongdoer connected even as he or she is held responsible. In fact, the process involves asking the same restorative questions to all the stakeholders. What happened? Who's been impacted? What can the wrongdoer do to make things right? And so whenever I talk about this and I do sensitization, particularly in the two that jump out would be in Indonesia and in South Africa because of cultural nuances. The question was asked, how do we adopt a restorative stance? And my answer was, by separating the deed from the doer, by rejecting the act, the unacceptable behavior, but not the actor, by acknowledging the intrinsic value, the intrinsic worth of the wrongdoer post-infraction, and the potential contribution to society, to his or her community, while still holding them accountable and while not making an intentional effort to not marginalize them. What is important to note is that the wrongdoer must admit guilt. The incident must have adversely affected or harmed someone. There must be a need to repair the harm, and the victim must agree to participate. All four elements must be met for a restorative process to even be initiated. And of course, that's one of the key differences between restorative processes and mediation. So let's talk a bit about how I apply restorative principles to support my argument for a discursive public health approach to wrongdoing and the wrongdoer. I don't think there's anyone in the room who would disagree that punishment as retribution belongs to an archaic penal philosophy, and that a lot of penologists have discredited it. Our correctional system, actually whose raison d'etre is to correct and rehabilitate and reintegrate, serves instead to protect society against crime and exact such punishment on the wrongdoer that the wrongdoer is expected to refrain from future wrongdoing regardless of the underlying reasons for the initial engagement in criminal activity. That's key. So what we're doing is we're only addressing the surface. And for me, my argument is that crime and violence are symptoms of a deeper social problem. And our response, our current retributive response, is addressing the symptom and not the problem. Restorative practices, the goal is to dig a little deeper by virtue of the types of questions asked and the structured process to find out what the underlying cause was and to address it from a community level. So the assumption is that we are pleasure seeking and just the fear of the punishment will stop us from engaging in crime or from recidivating. But I think based on the numbers in prison and the recidivism rates, that belief might be misplaced. We're also assuming that our goal as a society is to reduce crime by seamlessly reintegrating wrongdoers. And again, we're not seeing it happen because the correctional system is neither correcting nor reintegrating. Perhaps more importantly, we don't hold our correctional system to the mandate, its historic mandate. It does not correct and it does not reintegrate. Many have tried. A lot of us in society have complained that too much money is being spent on educating the inmates. A lot of those programs have been whittled away. But what is key is if you hold them and you maintain, when you release them 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years later, you're releasing them back into the same dysfunctional environment, and particularly in the case of juveniles, and they're ill-prepared. They're actually 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years behind education-wise, and then they're more likely to recidivate. So as far back as 1965, it was surmised that prisons do not achieve their goal. Instead, they're destructive. But yet we continue supporting them. And our support is a practice which, as we know from the prison industrial complex, facilitates higher profit margins for some unscrupulous businesses. And on average, 2.7 million citizens, the vast majority of whom in reality have the potential to be contributing members of society, are incarcerated or in one form or another engaged in the criminal justice system. Sorry, I was going to say I have 2 stalking dogs who love me in the background, and so you may hear one barking. I'm trying to keep them quiet. In essence, our criminal justice system does not dispense justice, and our correctional system does not correct. Enter restorative practices and restorative justice, which in essence is a public health approach to crime that aims to support transformative change. So this approach deals with violence as though it was an epidemic or contagious disease. To prescribe solutions, policymakers and program designers study and analyze the underlying cause of violence with an understanding that violence and crime are the symptoms of a deeper social problem, and they design targeted initiatives to curb its spread. Public health is a science based on a multidisciplinary approach, and it utilizes a broad knowledge base to successfully respond to a range of health conditions. And restorative practices suggests that this approach might result in long-term benefits. And let me explain about the time factor. Our penal system, the way it's structured, any positive impact on the wrongdoer will be short-term if we don't address the underlying causes. A restorative approach, which will be manifested in a public health approach, the goal will be to look at the problem for long-term benefits. If you address the underlying or root cause, the expectation is that the benefits will be long-term. So if the issue is really the dysfunctional environment that the juvenile is being returned to each time, then a long-term solution will be not just to keep putting them in juvie and releasing them, but removing them from that dysfunctional environment. So this necessarily means that violence must be viewed, one, as a symptom of a deeper issue, particularly in the case of the wrongdoer, and two, it must be viewed from the perspective that just as there are secondary and tertiary victims of wrongdoing, then perhaps we, members of society, are secondary and tertiary wrongdoers. In fact, one could argue that as communities of care of both the person who has been harmed and the wrongdoer, we, members of society, have failed the wrongdoer in some way, or we have created such a dysfunctional environment that the wrongdoer, for his or her own survival, was forced to engage in inappropriate, antisocial, illegal, non-conforming activities in the first place. So we're arguing that you don't just punish without a deeper dive into why they engaged in that type of activity in the first place. And this is particularly true for juvenile wrongdoers and wrongdoers who belong to other vulnerable or marginalized groups. And typically, the way we punish just adds to the marginalization and makes the individual wrongdoer more likely to reoffend. And so, in essence, guilt is subjective, and secondary and tertiary wrongdoers, that's us and the rest of society, hold varying levels of culpability based on social proximity to the primary wrongdoer. So the immediate secondary wrongdoers would be the immediate family, and tertiary might be the community, etc. So we, in essence, hold varying levels of culpability depending on how close we are to the primary wrongdoer. Application of a public health approach to violence emphasizes collective action from diverse sectors, including health, education, social services, justice policy, and the private sector, not only for the benefit of the victim or survivor, but perhaps more importantly, for the benefit of the wrongdoer, especially if the goal is to give the victims a greater sense of peace by reducing the likelihood that the wrongdoer will reoffend. And an example would be, I was brought into a particular country to set up their Restorative Justice division, starting at the governmental level. So the director of Restorative Justice would have been someone high up, a political appointee perhaps, and then structure the program coming downward. And so in doing that, I had to travel to various parts of the country to do some key informant interviews. And in one particular area, there was an 18-year-old who had stabbed another 18-year-old, and he was granted probation because he was a first-time offender. And so I was allowed to engage him in a restorative process. And so I went through the process, and one of the questions I asked him was to close his eye and tell me what was going through his head at the moment he stabbed the other youth. So of course I got a strange look, and then I said, go ahead, try it. Throw your mind back to what was going through your head when you stabbed this other person. And he said that they were playing, rough playing, and then the guy said something that was exactly what the four guys who beat him up every morning on the bus and take his lunch and money say to him every morning. He said, and he don't know what happened, he just flipped and picked up a knife and stabbed the guy. And so I called in the mother and the police officers, and I said, are you aware that he's an ongoing victim of bullying? The police said, no, there was no reason for us to dig deep. I said, so you put him on probation, and he goes back on the bus in the morning and he's bullied again. And this time the knife may not just be a flesh wound. This time it could be something more serious. So the after action report I got, the police officers rode with him on the bus the next morning, accosted the bullies and dealt with it in their, according to what their processes were. The point is that putting him on probation alone, as wonderful as it is to keep him out of the system, did not help him without digging deeper to find out why he did what he did. And then that led to him being a victim himself. And while no one is excusing his behavior, because he is still being held accountable, he still had to do community service, et cetera, et cetera. The fact of the matter is the solution is now more long-term and permanent because his underlying biopsychosocial needs were dealt with. So, and folks always ask, what about the wrongdoer? And I like to use that example, and there are many more where, and domestic violence is a classic, and this one is also one that causes a lot of disagreements. When you remove the abused from the equation and you leave the abuser, even if he's arrested for a short term and released, you've just created a space for him to bring another vulnerable victim in. He needs to be assessed as well. His biopsychosocial needs need to be addressed, whether it be alcoholism, anger management, whatever it is. And then he has to be held by the court responsible for seeking counseling for whatever his needs are. Similarly, the victim is to be assessed, not just because the victim was abused, but to make sure that the victim doesn't have any underlying issues that makes her pick abusers. Because, and this is not victim blaming, this is just being pragmatic. The abuser deliberately picks a certain type of personality, if you will, and the abused is attracted to a particular type of personality. Both need to be addressed. Otherwise, just removing the abused is only a temporary solution. And that's what we see when they end up calling the abuser back and then they end up being murdered because the underlying need has not been met. So it's analogous to an epidemic in which violence spreads, clusters, and transmits through exposure. And so we see, as restorative practitioners, we see violence as not symptomatic of bad people, but perhaps being better depicted as a negative health outcome resulting from exposure to numerous risk factors. And what we're saying is the risk factors need to be addressed as opposed to simply punishing for breaking the law. It's a type of trauma-based, trauma-informed approach, which suggests that there is underlying historic or situational trauma from every violent act. So notwithstanding the differences, restorative justice does have some similarities to the current retributive criminal justice model. Restorative processes, for example, embrace tenets of retributive justice in that wrongdoers are assumed to be mentally competent and morally culpable actors and are expected to accept responsibility for their actions and acknowledge the impact on the parties involved, as well as the wider community. Hence the reason their communities of care are invited to the process. So everyone has a say in what needs to be done to make the victim and the community feel whole again. We also like to make sure that folks understand that for those who do not admit guilt, or those who admit guilt and do not meet the requirements set out in the contract that they sign, they are relegated back to the traditional criminal justice system. But the key is that while we hold them accountable, the focus is on the unacceptable deed and not the doer. And the focus is on keeping them connected to the community rather than marginalizing them or stigmatizing them, which some of the terminology we use, like offender, it does that. Restorative processes include tertiary level prevention, which typically in the case of the victim is standard. They're assessed, their needs are identified, and their needs are met by them being registered in a variety of counseling or trauma classes. But this is done to the exclusion of the wrongdoer. And that's why while we want to focus on the needs of the victim and make sure the victim has a say in court as to what they need. For example, there was a case in one country where a 9-year-old stole a pie off of a woman's window. Every Wednesday, she baked pies to take to the market. He ran up, stole the pie. The neighbor saw, called the police. They arrested him. And then they came, brought him back to her. And her question was, why did you steal the pie? And he said, I'm hungry. Why are you hungry? Because I haven't eaten in days. Why haven't you eaten in days? Where are your parents? They're both passed out at the house. The police go to the house. The parents were high and one had OD'd, et cetera, et cetera. And so putting him in juvie would not have solved the problem. So the victim said she didn't want to press charges. What she wanted was to find out what they were going to do with him. They're going to remove him from the home. She wants them to make arrangements for him to come every Wednesday and help her take her stuff to the market. She will feed him, et cetera, et cetera. She took an interest in him. But the key was he had to be removed from that home. But realize it was the victim who asked the questions, not the police. So retributive justice places the emphasis on victim safety, punishment of the wrongdoer, which we have seen based on recidivism rates and the number of people in prison. They result in short-term results. What we're looking for is long-term healing of the individual, but also of the relationship. Don't lose sight of the ultimate goal. If applied correctly, restorative processes can lead to transformation of relationships, transformation of people, transformation of communities. In essence, the restorative process normalizes discursive dialogue and the interaction, the inclusion really is opposed to the existing adversarial process. Instead of one loses, one wins, one is right, one is wrong, it's a collective decision on what benefits all of us. And even though you are the wrongdoer, what are your needs? So you walk away winning as well. A fundamental feature of restorative justice is discursiveness. Discussion, everyone involved. You ask the offender, is there anyone else you need here to support you? Then you have to interview that person. And so it becomes a community-wide process, which really allows for the reproduction of the subjectivity of those involved, because it involves a lot of storytelling. Everybody tells their story. This is how I felt. The questions are so crafted as to elicit everybody's story. So rather than giving the privilege to the law or to the state, restorative solutions engage the people who have actually been harmed, the primary, secondary, tertiary victims, but it also involves the primary, secondary, and tertiary offenders, because unless a child was born bad, then his environment molded him. Therefore, the people with responsibility for his environment have to also accept must have some culpability as well. So that's where the discursiveness comes in, and that's why it's so important to create a non-judgmental space so that everyone is free to talk, which is what the restorative space does. And this aids in the healing process of the victim as well as the wrongdoer and their parties of care. We've had, typically there'll be a lot of tears, so restorative practitioners have to be well-trained and know when to lean in and lean back. And because the wrongdoer has to be willing and must have acknowledged guilt before the process starts, it sort of reduces the likelihood of the process being blindsided. They've acknowledged guilt, they're sorry, they want to make amends. The victim is willing, the victim doesn't want it to go to the court. So everyone is interviewed individually. And if the restorative practitioner in their experience determines that there is a potential for situational harm. In my case, because it's usually referrals from the court, we send it back and say, we do not recommend a restorative process at this time. We are concerned that there might be an opportunity for some physical harm, and then it goes through the traditional court process. So the practitioners, the facilitators, also have a responsibility to use what I call a spirit of discernment. It's just not a run-of-the-mill process. When you interview someone in one country, the mother of the bully victim said to me, "Sure, I want to be part of the process." And she gave me the finger and the neck. "Yeah, just put him in the room with me." And immediately I knew that's the kind of person who will fly across the table and collar that young man. So I sent it back to the school and I said, "Sorry, I don't think the participants are ready for this. You may have to take it through another process." So considerable effort is spent within the process, assessing the risks and needs of the victims and mitigating any potential harm. And that is on the facilitator. The facilitator has that responsibility. Facilitator has to be able to read the individuals involved. Sometimes it's not the victim, it's the secondary and it's not the primary victim, sorry, it's the secondary and tertiary victim. It's the embarrassed family, it's the mad community who all want to take up arms against the wrongdoer. So as the facilitator, you have to mitigate against those. In the final analysis, however, the restorative process is used to bring victims and wrongdoers together to enable the wrongdoer to acknowledge and accept responsibility and to allow the victim an opportunity to tell his or her story and to share with the wrongdoer the impact of his or her actions, and then to allow all parties to engage in a determination of what needs to happen to repair the harm. And I've had secondary wrongdoers speak to ways in which they could have handled it differently and make recommendations for the primary wrongdoer to go to some counseling, acknowledge on behalf of the primary wrongdoer that as a group, they should have held more responsibility because had this person had mentorship, guidance, food, family, community, they would not have felt marginalized, which pushed them into, and this is coming from the secondary and tertiary wrongdoers. So from a restorative point of view, although much emphasis is placed on the victims and the harm caused, there is a need to focus equally on the wrongdoer and the affected community so that all stakeholders' feelings are considered. There is argument, and I'm sure there are some of you saying right now, restorative justice is too soft. But this is a misperception because the process does not necessarily denounce the harm caused to the victim, but the approach to reparation, the approach to holding the wrongdoer accountable need not necessarily be punitive. The punitive approach has not worked, is not working, is short-term. So while we still hold the wrongdoer accountable, we still have the wrongdoer accept responsibility, acknowledge what they've done. Punishment does not have the long-term transformation that we feel a restorative approach does. There's also an argument that the restorative approach does not necessarily contradict justifications and trivializations made by the wrongdoer. It doesn't, but if the wrongdoer is justifying or trivializing his or her action, then they cannot get to a restorative process. They are not ready to engage in a restorative process. So if it gets to a restorative conference, for example, and the wrongdoer in the conference is trivializing or justifying, then that facilitator did not do his or her due diligence. As soon as the interview is being conducted of the wrongdoer and the wrongdoer is excusing or trivializing or justifying, no restorative process. The process argues that both the victim and the wrongdoer, as primary actors, as well as their communities of care, have roles to play in the conflict. So when you're interviewing the parents, the family members, and they're also trivializing, you're also seeing what perhaps led the wrongdoer to engage in this process. So this is a discussion you'll have to have with the referring agency. If it's the court, you let the court know that this is the feedback you got from the parents or the community, and you're not sure that they should be a party to the process, because that will stop the primary wrongdoer from engaging in an honest feeling of remorse. So the setting is non-adversarial. It provides the opportunity for wrongdoers to understand and take responsibility for their behavior without blaming the victim. And yet it allows the communities of care to identify the underlying comorbidities of the wrongdoer, the ones that have remained unaddressed, or past trauma, or drug abuse, or alcohol abuse, and then recommendations are made to, as part of the contract that's signed, and in the case of the court, given back to the court, must be assessed by a social worker and must meet all the requirements that the social worker identifies. And if they don't, then they go back through the court process. Although restorative processes represent more than just getting or giving justice, they ought not to be viewed as contradicting retributive processes, as they borrow and blend many elements from the traditional practices. Ultimately, however, it is about positively influencing human behavior in the long term. The use of an iterative process invites the active participation of the communities of care to not only accept some responsibility for the wrongdoer's actions, but to also share in the decision-making as well. The decision-making particularly about what needs to happen to heal the harm, what changes are going to be made in their interaction with the wrongdoer going forward, what needs to be done to meet the underlying needs of both the victim and the wrongdoer, how can all parties engage in behavior change that can contribute to the seamless reintegration of the wrongdoer and a reduction of the likelihood of recidivism. And that's the key. Reducing the likelihood that the wrongdoer will reoffend because we have thrust them back into the dysfunctional environment that existed or within which they existed that caused them to exhibit the type of behavior they exhibited in the first place. So, ladies and gentlemen, my goal today was just to whet your appetite. I hope I was able to do that. I invite you to register for the course and engage with us as we dissect existing structures and recreate systems that actually work. Join us not to get answers to the questions, but join us instead to question existing answers in a discursive way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dianne. That was wonderful. You've certainly continued to whet my appetite over and over again.
Thank you.
So I encourage people to please write in questions or comments. And while you're doing that, I have one or two comments I just want to pick back up on from what you were talking about that especially stood out to me. So I appreciated when you were saying what it is and what it's not. So you started out with differentiating it from mediation practices and so on, and also talking about its relationship to the criminal justice system and where it should be placed for its most effective nature. And I also appreciated that at the end of the day, we're trying to help the people who have offended become positively contributing members to society. And you talked about identifying the risk factors, and it's really wonderful. So you think about risk factors and the root causes of what really created that kind of behavior. It's not that people are born and wake up saying, I'm going to do this because I just want to be a bad guy or a bad girl. No, that's not what happens at all. But sometimes there are just limited opportunities, limited awareness of how to address the things that are happening and what else to do. And so I loved that you were talking about the practices really being a way to think about more systemically. It's not only the individual's behavior, but the individual is part of a bigger system. So that really stood out to me in what you were talking about before.
And I think it was important as well, because I think there is almost a visceral response when folks hear, especially folks within the criminal justice system, when they hear restorative, there's a visceral response, and then, oh, it's too soft. But I think we are being disingenuous because we recognize that the existing system is not working. So we have to be open to something that actually has the potential to work. And restorative practices is an age-old practice from the first people, the First Nation, the Aborigines. I was actually fortunate to travel to Alice Springs in Australia and sit with the Aborigines. And then I went to a reservation just across the border in Canada. It's fascinating to see how it works. And then, ironically, I was asked to train some Amerindian community leaders. And I'm thinking, you should be training me. This is your mainstay. But the challenge was they could not position the traditional practices within the current practice. And so my role was kind of reversed. But I say that to say it has been working, and we need to give an ear to something else that could potentially work, because what we're doing is not working.
Yeah, I mean, people may say it's too soft, but you're not letting them get away with it. You're holding them accountable for what they've done.
Correct.
So we do have some questions and some comments. So one person wrote, I greatly appreciate this approach. There are many resources for victims, but not as many for wrongdoers, which in itself is a symptom of the retributive tone of our society. Yet wrongdoers need help and need resources. So that's nice. Here is a question here. What role, if any, might restorative practices play in Title IX on the community level, particularly as it relates to reintegration into the community for victims, wrongdoers, or those who have been falsely accused, whether as students, staff, or faculty? You know, in the world today, if not before, it's if you even get accused, whether it's real or not, it's already tarnished your reputation. So any thoughts on that?
So let me give an example of an issue that a team of us were called in to address. A particular country was being forced to accept ex-combatants, those who had left and gone to join Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and now they were coming back, and the community refused to take them back, and the government mandated it. And so we were hired to engage in some restorative processes to make the process seamless, because the government said, come hell or high water, it's happening. And so two things happened. The community members got to hear how isolated the ex-combatants felt before they became ex-combatants. And then the ex-combatants got to hear how scared and embarrassed the community members were because of their actions. And then they were forced to actually talk to each other. What do you need to make you feel like you belong to this community? And what do you need to reduce the level of fear you feel for this young man that grew up in the house next to you? And it was an iterative process, a lot of tears, and a lot of healing coming out of it. What concerned me is the fact that they were forced to do it, but it happened to work. And a lot of what we get is the court forcing people into a mediate before you litigate, when both parties, one or more parties, really don't want to. But by saying that, what I think is missing is how we as a society are being trained. We are being trained to be retributive. We are being trained to isolate, trained to marginalize, trained to stigmatize. And that's why in the case of someone being wrongfully accused, The issue is just as much about how we receive or how we choose to forgive the wrongfully accused because it was wrong. So now, oh, so sorry, it was wrong, we didn't know, but we continue to penalize that person even after the wrongdoer has apologized for the wrongful accusation. So part of it is also on us and how we are trained and how we train ourselves, or even if it's a school, how you train the school community to be more accepting and more forgiving. Because even the acknowledgement that it was a lie doesn't change the fact that the person continues to be stigmatized. That's on us, the community. The person made the initial mistake, the wrongdoer. He or she has, I guess, apologized and retracted. But we don't allow the victim to reintegrate. We've already marginalized the wrongdoer, but we never quite forgive the victim, and that is on us.
Yeah. So that goes back to your earlier talk where it really is a system and it's really about a health perspective and the risk and all of that. So here's a question. If you realize your parties are not yet ready for the process, what steps can you take to prepare them? Is that part of your process when cases are court referred? You did talk about the discernment of whether or not to, so this might feed into that as well.
So in the one case I had where the mother gave me the finger in the neck, the victim was ready, the wrongdoer was ready, the mother was not ready. So there were two options. Either you don't have your mother in the process, but if you're a minor, you don't have an option, or you take it to the court and you say, we have a concern for this. In one case, the court actually put a police officer in the room, which I wasn't happy with, but I understood why. So you have to weigh it. If the wrongdoer and the victim are ready and they are of age, then you cannot have that parent or that rabble rouser present at all. But if it's a minor, the parent has to be ready, then take it to the court and let the court decide. Do they want to put a policeman in it? Do they want to give the mother talking to? But prepping is not going to help because if that's her mindset, that's her mind. She is actually waiting to do something inappropriate when she's in the same space as the bully, or even with the bully's mother, as in another case. So you either take it to the court, or if they're of age and they can make a decision without the parent, then you have it without the parent.
Mm-hmm. So what happens if the person himself or herself, do you assess their readiness for the process? Not only the
and
other
they're not
people?
ready, no, then you kick it back to the school, to the court, to whomever. And you've assessed and you've determined that the parties are not yet ready. There might be a risk of bodily harm. And so you send it back to the court, and then the court, more often than not, will take them through the regular court process.
So there's nothing specific you do to help prepare them. That's not part of the process.
You can't, no, you cannot. Okay. And somebody, I'm surprised someone hasn't asked this question. Sometimes people will pretend that they want to engage to avoid going through the criminal justice system. What the science has shown is that if they agree to sweeping somebody's yard for 6 months, I'm just using this as a point of reference, and they're chuckling to themselves, man, I got over, that was easy. They never make 6 months. They'll do it for 2 weeks and then they'll, because they got over that quickly. The science has shown they never finish it. And then you have to have a clause that says, if you fail to meet the stipulated requirements, then it's going to be kicked back to the court system. So there is a process.
It's safeguarded. Okay, another question. Can you share your strategies on how to manage the victim side during the process? For example, making them feel seen and validated throughout the whole process and not changing their minds once they agree on participating.
You would have started that process in the one-on-one interviews. So in one particular country, everyone was trained on the full process, and the country decided that the pre-conference interviews took too long. So they did not have the pre-conference interviews. As soon as the case was referred, they brought everybody together. One, there was a lot of physical altercation, but two, a lot of victims recanted because part of the pre-conference interview is to build that confidence and to make sure that the victim understands this is a safe space. The same questions I'm asking you, I'm asking them. They don't get to speak when you're speaking. You have the floor when you have the floor. This is about what you need. You're going to speak and you're going to have all the people that you tell me you want to have there to support you. But if you miss that pre-conference interview, all hell will break loose, as it did in this particular country. So you get a chance in the pre-conference interview to set the stage. And then they'll also tell you, because you'll ask, is there anyone else you need to be present in this process? My mother, my sister, my cousin, my best friends. You put them on the list, you interview all of them. How were you impacted? And then they all will be present in the conference.
Yeah, so it sounds like those interviews are part of like the intake process. You really want to set it up for success.
Yes.
You want to catch any red flags before.
That's right. And it's a mandatory part. In this one country, they just chose for expediency not to do it. And then they realized it didn't work.
Well, they paid the consequences.
They did. They did.
All right, we have one more question here. Also, can you speak about any observations on higher levels of outcome satisfaction among victims versus other methods of seeking justice?
So there's a lot of literature out there about outcome satisfaction. And there was one case where one young man actually murdered another. This is a case that it's a case study when we're actually being trained. And the young man who murdered this woman's son, she wanted to see him, to meet him. And she asked the judge, and it became a semi-restorative. Because of the heinousness of the crime, he still had to do some time. But when she found out about his background, how his parents chained him to a dog cage during the day when they went to work, and how he was often starved and beaten, yada, yada, she decided she was going to take him under her wing. Because she said, if you were my son, you would never have been raised like that. And that helped her to forgive. And she said she got more satisfaction than if he had just been locked up, or if he'd been given a death sentence, which was one of the options. So there are a lot of stories. There's a lot of research about increased victim satisfaction, more so because the victim has a say. The victim says, I don't want the court or the state to tell me what I need. I want to say what I need. I need an apology. I need to know why. I want my stuff back. In the case of death, you can't get that back, but at least you get to understand why. But the victim gets to say, and the victim's community, and actually the community of the wrongdoer, they get to say what they need. And most times the people want an apology. They want to know why. They want back some memorabilia that was important to them, because just locking the person up does not help the victim, especially if the victim never had a say.
Yeah, wow. Another question. What have you found to be the biggest barriers and opportunities to launching and integrating restorative justice programs into criminal justice programs?
The fact that the criminal justice system has become a business, if we actually corrected people and sent them on their way and they didn't come back, then a lot of the businesses that are benefiting from the current structure will not benefit. So it's almost like the current structure needs to have people in prison. And so there's pushback, I think, because a restorative approach is interrupting a particular flow that exists right now. Because if we truly are interested in long-term transformation, people should be running to it. But I'm finding it's easier. I get more invitations to train. Strangely enough, just before this, I got a call, can I go to Uganda in 2 weeks? I'm getting more invitations out of the US than in the US because the prison system is a business. That's the biggest pushback. But in the small areas where I operate, I've had about 6 training sessions throughout 2021. The people get it. They get it. They push for it. They're absolutely engaged in it. People tweak it to suit the particular context. But by and large, the system is pushing back because it'll change a particular flow that currently exists. And I'm being politically correct as I speak.
Yeah, I think we have to think of some alternative revenue streams so they can put their energy
somewhere else.
Something constructive.
Yes.
Yeah, we do have one of the participants who asked some questions, say, thank you so much. So looking forward to this class. So that's great.
Very good. Thank you.
So we're almost out of time. If anybody has a last minute comment or question, please send it in. And I just want to ask you, Dianne, is there anything else that you wanted to add that maybe now comes to mind, having looked at some of these questions?
Yeah, I want you all to come take the class. It's even when the folks at Columbia looked at the structure of my class, one person said, oh, you make me want to take this class. I put a lot of thought and time and energy into it. It's designed to make you think and to make you question historic practices. And for me, it's intriguing, and I encourage you to sign up for the class.
That's great. I also think it's important for people in the program, people in the field, and I say the field in general, a very broad way of being in the field, because there's so many different ways to take it up, that I think learning more about this and using it within the criminal justice system or in some other places, and some of the practices that are here that maybe can be integrated into other ways of dealing with conflict in different kinds of societies, and also especially the conflict transformation when you have places where there had been conflict, small or large scale, and you're trying to transition into a different way. Some of those resentments still carry over. So you want to be able to go through this kind of practice so that there can be some healing. And that was a word that came to mind when I heard you speaking before, is about the whole healing process.
Correct. Correct. Because even now I'm engaged with a particular organization where they go to foreign countries and they work on the ground, and there is no cultural sensitivity. We're taking something that worked in one part of the country and taking it to another and expecting it to work. And it's not working because we're not addressing historic harm, and we're not weaving in healing processes in whatever program we're putting on the ground. So, yeah.
Yeah, you can't always import things the way they are.
Correct.
And it's always a pleasure engaging with you, Dianne, and we look forward to seeing you soon and seeing how your course is.
Thank you. Thanks so much.